Today is December 3rd, 2023. The U.S. proxy war against Russia and Ukraine continues. I want to start by taking a look at the map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map, so keep that in mind as we take a look at the line of contact. If we go to southern Ukraine, near Crimea, along the Dnieper River, Kherson, we can see there are no indicators of any progress in this Ukrainian cross-river operation that they've been conducting. And if we zoom out a little bit, let's suppose that they do somehow manage to cross the Dnieper River, accumulate enough forces to execute an offensive southward. This entire area is filled with kilometers of layered Russian defenses. And this is according to a December 2022 article published by the New York Times, where they had maps, satellite images, and photographs and diagrams of these Russian defenses that were already very extensive last year. Late last year, they only were built up further from that point onward. Those were the same networks of defenses that the Russians used to stop Ukraine's spring/summer offensive, which lasted 5 months and is now all but admitted to have failed, and it was because of those defenses. So this Ukrainian cross-river operation is a distraction, a diversion. It is done purely for perhaps political reasons. It is not a serious operation that has any chance of gaining any sort of strategic momentum. Going back to the map, speaking of the Ukrainian offensive, this was the full extent of their gains over the course of 5 months. This indentation here, the salient, was meant to extend all the way to the coast, so you can see how far short they fell of their actual objectives. And we see the red rifle icons from this red Russian-held territory. That indicates Russian forces are pushing back, they're clawing back that territory Ukraine struggled for 5 months. As we get to the east, the Donbas region, Donetsk City, right here, if we zoom in to Marinka. Now, this is a town. I've heard Alexander Mikuris from the Duran talk about this very often, about rumors among pro-Russian sources saying that it has fallen or is about to fall over the last couple of weeks or months. But this is a pro-Ukrainian live map, and now even they are saying that Marinka is fully held by Russian forces. And if we go a little bit north of Marinka, outside of Donetsk City, here at Avdeevka, we can see this pro-Ukrainian map indicating the progressive encirclement of this heavily fortified city that Ukraine has been fortifying since 2014. We can see them cutting off this main logistics route here near this industrial area, the coke plant that you may hear about in news reports, and we can see how this encirclement is closing. And again, we keep hearing from the Western media, pro-Ukrainian sources, about Russia failing to take Avdeevka. This is not what Russia is attempting to achieve here. They are maneuvering their forces, improving their positions, but it is to cut off Avdeevka. It is not to storm and take Avdeevka. They have demonstrated this process multiple times. Mariupol, Lysychansk, and Severodonetsk, Bakhmut, this attempt to cut off the forces, whittle them down, and then take the city. That is what Russia is aiming for here. They want to win by attrition. They do not want to win by storming the city and losing huge amounts of their own men and equipment in the process. I'll talk a little bit more about the nature of the fighting along the line of contact in just a moment, but let's just finish up with an overview of the battlefield. You can still see lots of fighting around Bakhmut. Again, red rifle icons indicate that it is Russian forces taking the initiative on the attack. We do not see any operations being conducted by Ukrainian forces that could be considered a serious offensive operation. And that brings me to this article from the BBC. Ukraine war, Zelensky says fortifying front lines must be accelerated. We're not talking about offensive operations anymore. That is over with. They're talking about going on the defensive because Russia is on the attack all along the line of contact. And I've been talking about this in my updates regarding Ukraine. Russia is putting pressure along the entire line of contact. They're putting pressure on Ukrainian defenses, looking for weaknesses and exploiting them wherever they find them. This is what the BBC article says. Ukrainian President Vlodymr Zelensky has said defenses must be quickly beefed up across the front line after meeting commanders in some of the main pressure points in the south and east. In all major sectors where reinforcement is needed, we must speed up building of structures, he said in his nightly address. Russian forces are trying to encircle the eastern town of Avdeevka, and they are targeting the southern regions of Kherson and Zaporozhye, which I just showed you on the map. Ukrainian leader said maximum attention would be paid to eastern towns coming under fire in the Donetsk region, as well as a key defensive line in the northeast between Kupiansk and Lyman. He also included the region around the capital Kiev, where fortifications would be bolstered. President Zelensky's emphasis on strengthening defensive lines may lend weight to fears of an increasingly frozen conflict, despite some continued fierce fighting. Ukraine counteroffensive since the summer is widely viewed as having failed to quickly deliver hoped-for gains. It is widely seen as having failed, period. Now, the BBC article also says the industrial hub of Avdeevka has been almost encircled in recent weeks by Russian forces. So this is the BBC, along with the pro-Ukrainian live map, confirming this, who now control areas to the north and south as well as the east of the town. And then they talk about this spokesman from Ukraine's 47th Mechanized Brigade fighting in and around Avdeevka. This had been one of the Western trained and equipped brigades that took part in the 5-month offensive and was ground to a pulp. Now what remains is fighting in Avdeevka. They say that the situation has become constantly difficult. One community to the northwest of Avdeevka, Stepove, was coming under repeated attack, and Russians were sending significant forces in a bid to seize a nearby coke plant just outside Avdeevka. Without taking the coke plant, they can only dream about capturing Avdeevka, and I'm not convinced they have such power to do that, although very many of them are concentrated there, he told Ukraine's public broadcaster. But we've heard this type of delusional talk before. Again, in regards to Lysychansk and Severodonetsk, Mariupol, Bakhmut, and now we're hearing it in regards to Avdeevka. And we heard this all throughout the duration of the 5-month offensive, how these Ukrainian spokesmen on the ground see one thing, but reality is manifesting itself in a diametrically opposed manner. The BBC also reports in the southeast as well, Russian forces have sought to regain areas lost during Ukraine's counteroffensive around Robotyne. And I showed you that on the map, according to Ukrainian officials who say they are managing to maintain positions they recaptured recently on the east bank of the river Dnieper. Now, this is in regards to this cross-river offensive. They were supposed to be building a bridgehead and then going on the offensive. Now they're talking about just holding on to this territory that they claim that they've captured, which is negligible and is not even showing up on the pro-Ukrainian map. So this is the state of things on the battlefield. This BBC article, the admissions of the Ukrainian president, spokespeople from various Ukrainian brigades, they're all admitting that offensive operations are essentially over. They're now on the defensive. That is where they are now at the end of their 5-month offensive. And I said that this was going to happen. They were going to, no matter where the offensive ended on the battlefield, they were going to lose an army's worth of men, equipment, and ammunition. and they would be actually weaker at the end of their offensive than when they began, and this would leave them vulnerable to Russian pressure along the line of contact. That is exactly what has now transpired. NATO is unable to replace these losses Ukraine suffered during this 5-month offensive. Now we're hearing about all of these not only equipment and ammunition shortages, but now also manpower shortages. There's talk that I'm hearing from various pro-Western analysts talking about how 2024 is going to be a year of building. They're going to build up Ukrainian military power for going on the offensive in 2025. But what do they think they're going to be able to build over the next year that is going to be sufficiently powerful enough to make any sort of gains in 2025? Because at the same time they're doing this, Russian military power is also growing. It's actually growing much quicker and also accelerating. I don't see how in a year's time Ukraine will be in a better position to go on the offensive. And remember the debate that we heard about before Ukraine launched its 2023 offensive. Some said Ukraine should have rushed and launched the offensive earlier before Russia built all of these defenses. Others say they should have waited longer and built up enough military power to punch through these defenses. But either way, when you actually look at what's going on, Ukraine really didn't have a chance, whether they sped up their operations or they delayed them. It was going to make no difference. Those defenses were impossible for Ukraine to punch through given the equipment and capabilities that they had. And nothing that the West can transfer over to Ukraine can change that. And nothing between now and the end of 2024 is going to change that. Let's just look at different types of equipment. I've not seen any increase in the number of artillery pieces being sent. I'm going to talk about artillery shells again here in just a moment. Let's just talk about main battle tanks. The Leopard 2, built by Germany, supplied in certain numbers to Ukraine ahead of their offensive. They were used in the offensive. We saw them burning in large numbers on the battlefield. We still see them from time to time popping up and being targeted and destroyed, what's left of them. And we don't hear about these lost Leopard 2s being replaced. Instead, we see NATO sending Leopard 1 tanks. This is a tank designed in the 1950s. It has less armor. It is more lightly armed than the Leopard 2. It has less sophisticated fire control and sights, which are things that can be upgraded, of course. But what can the Leopard 1 achieve that the Leopard 2 could not? And the answer is nothing. It is inadequate. If the Leopard 2 was inadequate, the Leopard 1 is even more inadequate. The UK supplied a token number of Challenger 2 tanks. One was already destroyed. We haven't really seen much of the whatever remains of these Challenger 2 tanks, and the UK is in no position to send any more to Ukraine. And the few that they did send are negligible. They will make absolutely no difference on the battlefield. The US also sent a token number of M1 Abrams main battle tanks. Of course, they could send these in larger numbers, theoretically, but again, the M1 Abrams has a turbine engine. It is a sophisticated piece of hardware. It requires a lot of training to become proficient on. It also requires a huge logistical back end to support it on the battlefield, to keep it fueled, supplied, armed, and maintained. The US has the logistical capabilities to do this anywhere in the world, but Ukraine does not, and it will not. And so sending more M1 Abrams is more or less out of the question. They also consume much more fuel than, say, the Leopard 1 or 2 or the Soviet-era tanks that Ukraine had been using up until now and are still using to a certain extent. Now, of course, there's plenty of armored personnel carriers, a fair number of infantry fighting vehicles, including old ones that aren't being used anymore, and of course, huge numbers of more lightly armed vehicles, things like Humvees and their equivalents, all across NATO. We see a steady number of these being funneled into Ukraine over time, but these alone are inadequate. You cannot achieve anything on the battlefield of strategic value with just this type of equipment. Lacking main battle tanks, lacking sufficient artillery and air power, lacking sufficient numbers of properly trained soldiers, all of the light armored vehicles, APCs, and infantry fighting vehicles in the world will not make any difference. And I think that's what we're seeing on the battlefield in Ukraine right now. Now, speaking of artillery ammunition, and this is very important to understand, this is one of the most important aspects of the fighting in Ukraine. We see that it has become an artillery and long-range fires war. We have this article from Defense One. In race to make artillery shells, US, EU see different results. DoD's early success may founder on congressional inaction, while Europe's private firms await orders. And it says 1 year into efforts to boost production of artillery rounds for Ukraine, the United States and Europe are seeing radically different results. The US has increased its output of 155 millimeter shells far faster than it originally forecasted and plans to increase it further if Congress can pass a budget for the nearly 2-month-old fiscal year. Europe has moved more slowly than it intended to, hampered by the consensus-focused nature of NATO and the EU. And in a twist that belies Europe's reputation for state-owned businesses, its dilemma is set by market conditions, while US progress is made possible by state control of ammo manufacturing. Now, the increases on the US side are more or less expected. They announced that they were going to aim for this production increase, and now they've been incrementally working towards it. And I assume that the US and the EU would match US production increases, and together that's what they would be supplying Ukraine come 2025, between 2025 and 2027. But now we're hearing about how Europe is falling behind, and how even if the US is able to reach its target or even exceed it, it's still going to fall far short of what Ukraine actually needs. The article says, before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the Army, they're talking about the US Army, produced around 14,155 millimeter rounds a month in government-owned contractor-operated munitions plants. In December 2022, Army Secretary Christine Wormuth said the Army was looking to increase production to 20,000 rounds per month by the spring and 40,000 rounds per month by 2025. The service now aims to boost its monthly production to 36,000 by March, 60,000 by September, 70,000 to 80,000 in early 2025, and 100,000 a month by the end of calendar year 2025. 2.5 times more than the original year-old goal. As part of this push, the Army has added shifts, bought robots, and expanded its ammunition plants. And in this footage from CNN, you can see the inner workings of one of these US artillery shell production facilities. You can see robots and other modern equipment being used. They're talking about 100,000 shells a month by the end of 2025, but only if they get congressional money to do so, which I think they will. But that's still only 1.2 million shells a year versus the around 2 million artillery shells a year the US believes Russia is producing now or working toward producing within this or next year. And that's according to, again, the New York Times. In this article, Russia overcomes sanctions to expand missile production, officials say. But it also talks about all other aspects of Russian military-industrial production that are increasing. And it says, Western officials believe Russia is on track to manufacture 2 million artillery shells a year, double the amount Western intelligence services had initially estimated Russia could manufacture before the war. And we've heard all of these estimates about how Russia cannot produce anything of any quality. And now we see how that whole narrative has been turned inside out as reality manifests itself on the battlefield. And they're no longer able to paper over it with their narratives, their propaganda, essentially. Russia is going to also continue expanding its artillery shell production. It's also tapping into shell supplies from allies, reportedly, according to the West. So we've heard about millions of rounds coming from North Korea. And even if both the US and EU produced 1.2 million shells each per year by the beginning of 2026, it would still be producing less than Russia will at that point, most likely. But it doesn't look like Europe's going to reach those numbers. They're not going to match US production targets. The article is talking about all of these things that they need to do or could possibly do to increase artillery shell production, including creating a supranational organization to handle munition production, acquiring more money to throw at these companies to increase production. But these are things that they're only talking about. If and when they decide to exercise any of these options, it will still be another 1, 2, possibly even 3 years before they reach these production targets. Now this brings me to the next topic. I want to talk about these FPV drones, first-person view drones. You wear a headset, you see what the drone sees. The drone has a explosive, some type of ordnance attached to it, and the drone operator guides the drone into a target. It could be a fortified position, it could be a vehicle of some sort, it could just be a group of troops out in the field or in their trench. And we see pro-Ukrainian commentators providing an extremely filtered version of what is happening on the battlefield. They only show Ukrainian successes. They never show any of their failures. They certainly don't show any Russian successes. And some of the most frequent footage you will see are of these first-person view drones hitting Russian targets, hitting Russian troops, tanks even, destroying tanks even. They've had success with these FPV drones. There's no doubt about that. And particularly around Avdeevka, where Russian forces have been trying to make advances as part of this encirclement of the fortified city. And as they move forward, they face waves of these FPV drones, and they are taking out numbers of Russian troops and equipment, although not nearly as much as Ukrainian general staff say. So to give you an idea of what Ukrainian general staff says, this is Newsweek, just repeating what the Ukrainian general staff claim. The headline is, Russia loses 32 APVs and nearly 1,300 soldiers in a day. Ukraine. But down here it even admits Newsweek could not independently verify the battlefield figures. And they say these figures were released by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And I've heard these claims often that Russia is losing 1,000 or more troops every single day. And yet, when you go to, I would say, a more reasonable assessment of Russian losses that actually makes sense versus the fighting we see taking place on the battlefield, this is Mediazona. It's maintained by US-backed opposition, Russian opposition figures. This is their Russian casualties in Ukraine. Mediazona count updated. It was last updated on December 1st. And if you scroll down, you will actually see an uptick right here in October. This is when Russia began their operations around Avdeevka. But as you can see, what are the numbers per day? You can see it right here. 60, 61, 40, 69. There's no number over 100 anywhere in October, which is a far cry from the 1,000 the Ukrainian general staff are claiming. And this is what the Ukrainian general staff have done this entire conflict. They have exaggerated absolutely everything. And if anything they said was even half true, the battlefield would look totally different. We wouldn't be having these conversations about Ukraine having to go on the defensive, possibly negotiating away territory with Russia. But the point is, these FPV drones being used by Ukraine are being presented by some as a success story for Ukraine and as an alternative for artillery shells. They're admitting they have this artillery shell shortage. They have a shortage of other long-range fires. They claim that they can use these FPV drones as some sort of stopgap. But here's the problem. As effective as these FPV drones are for Ukraine, they are no substitute for artillery fire. Artillery fire covers longer distances, wider areas. It can be more intense for a greater duration if you have enough shells than FPV drones can ever hope to be. You can use artillery very precisely using satellite or laser guided shells, or you can hit a very wide area with a multitude of shells. You also have rockets and missiles, multiple launch rocket systems. The Grad, for example, firing large volumes of rockets at a targeted area, destroying everything in that area with this rocket fire. Also, you have very precise rocket fire. The Tornado S, for example, it is the Russian equivalent of HIMARS with a longer range than HIMARS. Satellite-guided rockets that can hit targets very precisely, much further than these FPV drones could ever hope of hitting. If you're using these FPV drones in conjunction with long-range fires, that will be very, very effective. To think you can use FPV drones instead of long-range fires, that is delusional. That does not add up on the battlefields. Another problem that Ukrainian FPV drones have is, despite their success, Russia is still advancing around Avdeevka. So they're claiming they're using these FPV drones. They're taking out these huge tolls on Russian troops. And yet Russia continues successfully encircling Avdeevka and creating an operational crisis for Ukraine. I just talked about the casualty numbers, how Ukraine is exaggerating them, how they're nowhere even close to that, even looking at other pro-Ukrainian sources. So that is a problem, and that is because they only have FPV drones and a dwindling amount of long-range fire to use to stop Russian advances around Avdeevka. They also have a lack of properly trained troops to do that because they exhausted it during their 5-month-long offensive. And now the third problem Ukraine has is that despite the effectiveness of their FPV drones, Russia also has them. Not only do they also have them, they have them in much greater numbers. And not only do they have them in much greater numbers, they also have electronic warfare capabilities that will ensure a certain number of Ukrainian FPV drones don't actually reach their target. A certain number of them just will not hit their target because of effective Russian electronic warfare, whereas Ukraine does not have nearly as effective electronic warfare, and so Russian FPV drones exist in larger numbers and have a much higher success rate. And that's not just me saying that. That is according to the Western media. This is a Reuters article. Some Ukraine drone pilots fear early advantage over Russia, now lost. And it's a dubious claim to make that they ever had any advantage over Russia. I think it was just the Western media holding off for as long as possible, admitting that Russia not only had these drones, but had them in larger numbers. It says, the soldiers piloting Ukraine's fleet of small, cheap assault drones are voicing concerns that despite pioneering their use, they are now being leapfrogged by their adversary as Moscow pumps money and resources into its drone sector. The use of agile first-person view FPV drones in battle has been one of the most successful of the various low-cost strategies Ukraine has used to defend itself from full-scale invasion by Russia, its much richer and more powerful neighbor. So now, before Russians were going into battle in bare feet carrying shovels, now they're much richer and more powerful. However, Moscow has also gradually mirrored and increased its use of these drones, which were originally made for racing by hobbyists and enthusiasts, but are modified to carry explosives to devastating effect. Every week, both countries publish onboard camera footage from FPVs, which cost several $100s flying toward and taking out enemy tanks and radar systems worth millions. And here's another point to make. Even if FPV drone attacks were equal on both sides. Russia just has many more tanks and radar systems that they can spare to lose than Ukraine. But it's not even. It's not even. Russia has many more drones and they're carrying out many more successful attacks than Ukraine is. The article also admits their drones are always in the air. They're talking, this is a Ukrainian talking about Russian drones. Their drones are always in the air day and night. We can see they've implemented serial production of drones for reconnaissance, surveillance, and for strikes. This is a 34-year-old drone platoon commander. He introduced himself by the call sign Comrade. While it is hard to assess Russian numerical superiority in FPV accurately, and the experiences of the unit near Bakhmut provides only a snapshot of what is happening, Comrade estimated it at around double what Ukraine had on his sector of the front. So again, and this shouldn't surprise anyone, if Russia could make more artillery shells, more tanks, more anti-air systems, more aircraft, why wouldn't they also be able to make these cheap, affordable FPV drones? And then again, the electronic warfare, that is not me making this claim, that is from the Western media, The Economist. Russia is starting to make its superiority in electronic warfare count. And it also says there may not be much the West either can or will do to help Ukraine. And The Economist explains, Ukraine has trained an army of some 10,000 drone pilots who are now constantly engaged in a cat-and-mouse game with increasingly adept Russian EW operators, electronic warfare operators. The favored drones are cheap, costing not much more than $1,000 each, and Ukraine is building enormous quantities of them. But losses to Russian EW, which either scrambles their guidance systems or jams their radio control links with their operators, have at times been running at over 2,000 a week. The smitten drones hover aimlessly until their batteries run out and they fall to the ground, neither hardening them against jamming nor investing them with artificial intelligence to fly without a live link to a human operator are feasible options yet, at least for mini drones. Quantity still wins out over quality, but Russia may have an advantage there too. And here they admit, again, a 2-to-1 advantage at least. And then it talks about this report published in May by Jack Watling and Nick Reynolds of RUSI, a think tank in London. They reckon the Russians are fielding one major EW system every 10 kilometers along the front line. They think that among many Russian EW systems, the truck-mounted Chipovnik Arrow, this here, pictured in the article, is proving especially deadly to Ukrainian drones. The system has a 10-kilometer range and can take over control of the drone while acquiring the coordinates of the place from where it is being piloted with an accuracy of 1 meter for transmission to an artillery battery, a Russian artillery battery, of which there are many more and are supplied by many times more artillery shells than Ukraine has on hand. And so this goes back to the advantage Russia has in terms of long-range fires, and they also have this advantage in electronic warfare, plus they themselves have FPV drones operating in larger quantities and carrying out strikes more successfully than Ukraine. So it's a complete mismatch, and it is a mismatch that is growing over time. They admit that they can't do anything about this. The collective West has not invested at the same level Russia has over the decades in electronic warfare, and the electronic warfare instruments and systems that they do have, they don't want to transfer to Ukraine because it is highly sensitive technology that they don't want Russia getting their hands on. But that said, despite all of these advantages Russia has, why don't we see Russia sweeping over the battlefield? And the answer is, even with a smaller amount of artillery fire, a smaller number of FPV drones, but also access to landmines, even if they're not used as extensively as Russia uses them, you're still able to create a very high cost for Russia attempting to use Western-style maneuver warfare, which is why Russia is not using it. This is the same problem Ukraine had trying to breach Russian defenses, Russian long-range fires, Russian minefields. In order to clear a minefield, you need to neutralize the long-range fires of the enemy on the opposite end of the field so that you don't come under fire while breaching it. To breach it, you need to bring in line charges, other types of military engineering equipment, and clear a path through the minefield. And you do not want to come under fire while doing that, and then your forces can pass through the minefield onward toward the enemy. This is what the United States did in Iraq. They were able to do this because it was such a military mismatch. The US had superior air power, superior long-range fires. They were able to completely eliminate heavy Iraqi weapons on the opposite end of these minefields. They were able to breach them without coming under fire. I mean, they would come under small arms fire, but nothing heavy, nothing that could stop them. And then they would proceed. That is not possible in Ukraine. It is not possible for Ukraine to do this. It is not possible for Russia to do this. It would not be possible for the United States to do this. There is just simply no way to neutralize the long-range fires of the enemy, clear the minefield without coming under fire. So Russian forces come to these minefields. They have a choice to try to speed through them and take heavy losses that way, or attempt to clear them, come under fire while doing so from Ukrainian artillery, first-person view drones, and other weapon systems. Instead, Russian forces do this methodical, incremental advance over the battlefield. If there are these brief opportunities where they can surge forces in and improve their positions, they will, but it'll go right back to this incremental fighting. It is possible for Russia to accumulate huge amounts of men and equipment and surge it into an area and overwhelm Ukrainian defenses. Yes, that is possible, but they will suffer heavy losses, just like Ukraine suffered during their 5-month offensive. And why do that if you can take your time, do it incrementally, and lose far fewer troops and equipment doing so, and gain the same result? Also consider the fact that as Russia is slowly inching across the battlefield, they are also conducting these deep strikes far behind the line of contact, using cruise missiles, long-range drones. They're increasingly using their military aviation along the line of contact. They are whittling down Ukrainian military capabilities, and as they do that, their military operations become incrementally more effective. We've seen this in regards to air defenses, whittling down Ukrainian air defenses faster than the West can build them back up, and we can see how Russian military aviation has been increasingly operating more freely along the line of contact in ways that they couldn't at the beginning of the special military operation. Russia will continue putting pressure on Ukraine along the line of contact. They will continue whittling down military capabilities, using their deep strike capabilities on production, on staging, on training facilities across the country. They will also continue expanding their military industrial production in ways that the West cannot match. And they will continue putting this pressure on Ukraine and its Western backers to make it abundantly clear that they're not going to give up. They will outlast the West. We see the West coming to terms with this reality. How exactly it's going to end, I have no idea. The West has been painted into this corner. They are more desperate than ever, and when they are desperate, they are dangerous. So we have to keep a very close eye on this. I will continue tracking this particular conflict, all other conflicts taking place as part of the US-led unipolar world order, struggling to prevent the emergence of multipolarism. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Check the video description for all of the links that I referenced during this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee or through Patreon. And to everyone who has been, whether it's a one-time donation or donations month to month, or even if you're just helping share this work with others, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what allows me to continue doing this work. So thank you again. And as always, thank you for watching.